People, when they vote and they vote in private, will make a decision about whether they think the next 4 years will be secure or less secure for them if they vote one way or the other. And I actually think that is the issue. Jewish insecurity has become a dominant theme among Jewish voters, and that has to be problematic for Biden.
Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. I want to talk today about the state of the U.S. presidential election and specifically the Jewish vote. There's a lot going on, as we all know, with the American Jewish community these days, and it all seems to be bad news. Last Friday, I had a column that I called "The Jewish Vote is Up for Grabs," and it may decide the election. And it was based on a conversation that I had with an old friend of mine from Chicago, Richard Baehr, who is one of the co-founders of the American Thinker website, very important website, and their former political correspondent. And so Richard and I had a series of back and forths about the state of the race, and I asked him if he would join me on the show today to go through the numbers with me. And I'll just, by way of introduction, I'll say that aside from all of his official titles, Richard is just about the most knowledgeable person on presidential polling, on presidential statistics that I've ever met, and that includes people like Michael Barone. He just has an encyclopedic knowledge of facts and figures related to presidential races. So I was really pleased that, Richard, that you're able to join us today. So first of all, welcome, Richard Baehr, to the Caroline Glick Show. Thanks so much for being on the program with me today.
Thanks for the invitation and the very kind words.
Well, let's just cut right to the chase. Before we get to the Jewish vote, can we just talk a little bit about the state of play in this election? The polls seem to be all over the place. They seem to be good for Trump, and then every once in a while you get these polls that show that, no, Biden is ahead 10 points in Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. So can you just go through what is the state of the race right now as they stand in the polls?
Yeah. Most of the head-to-head polling, two-candidate polling, show a very close race. With Trump probably averaging 1 to 2 point advantage over Biden, though not consistently. There are polls that show Trump ahead by 6 points. There's the CNN poll this week, 9 points in the Harvard poll. And you also get another poll like ABC, which came out this week and showed a 4-point lead for Biden. So that's a very wide dispersion to get that 6 months out. And it's entirely different than either of the two times Trump's run before. He never led a national polling race against either Clinton or Biden in any poll taken at any time during either of those two cycles. And really over the last 6 months, he's fairly consistently held on to a small lead. And the assumption is, well, that'll crater because he's going to get convicted somewhere with so many cases. And
so wait, before we go into that, let me just clarify. Are you talking about national polls? Because I guess they don't have that much relevance. I'm thinking more about state-by-state polls. But you're saying overall polls.
Well, overall polls. But the interesting thing is Trump won in 2016, though he lost the national race by 2.1%. He won the Electoral College with 306 electors. And in 2020, he lost by 4.5%, but he still came within 25,000 votes shifting in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin from winning again. So the national polls, in general, he does not as well as he does in some of these swing states. And so that's really the reason I was talking about the difference that he never led in 2016 and 20 and is ahead now, because from his perspective, if he's even in the national polls, he should win the swing states if the same relationship carried in the last two elections.
Okay, now talk a little bit about the criminal trials that he's facing or that he's undergoing, really, as we speak. How do they impact the state of the race?
Yeah. During the primary season, I think they helped him because his supporters, who tend to be very loyal, saw this as lawfare and sort of singling him out for treatment never yet afforded to any candidate ever for president from a major party. And it's easy to agree with him, because the idea that he's not being indicted once, but he's being indicted in 4 separate locations, some of which for fairly trivial things that would never get litigated for an average citizen, no less a former president who's running for president again. The bet by the Democrats is that he's going to get convicted somewhere. With so much out there, he's got to lose somewhere. And if he loses, some of the people who might be in his camp, especially the softer supporters, might essentially throw in the towel and assume that this is not going to work out. He's not going to survive. And then you have a known versus an unknown, and his numbers would drop. So far, that hasn't happened. But there is a real reality to this, which is he's not out there fundraising. He's not out there campaigning. His time is in the courtroom. And if you watch Fox News, you think that people are looking at what's going on in the college campuses. You watch MSNBC or CNN, there's more attention being paid to the day-by-day of his trial. So the obsession with getting him and bringing his numbers down and defeating him is what a large percentage of the population who tune in are still seeing. So I think there's a risk for him, and he knows it. His fundraising has picked up a little bit the last couple of weeks, but his legal bills are pretty enormous at this point, and he's using some of that to cover it.
The weird thing, though, is that Biden doesn't seem to be campaigning either, right? I mean, like when you look at his campaign organization, he doesn't seem to have much of one, and he's not going out on the trail really. And when he does, he speaks to very small audiences. So it almost feels like Biden isn't really running. I mean, that I don't remember a previous election when any candidate, whether it's a president seeking re-election or a challenger, it had such a non-presence on the campaign trail the way I guess Biden did in 2022, but he did it under the justification of COVID. So here, it just feels weird, like he's not really running, and it makes you kind of feel like something's fishy with the whole re-election bid. How do you,
Right.
what do you look at when you look at that? Or what do you see?
Yeah, I think he's campaigning more than he did in 2020, and you're certainly correct that even 4 years ago, they were afraid to put him out in front of a general audience and let him ad lib, because if he's not scripted, he's got real problems. And when he's scripted, he says, pause 4 more years. So, I mean, it's kind of pathetic, actually, to think the leader of the free world is in such a state. But his major campaign events now are delivering cash. He shows up in states where he can announce, this is the amount of money you're getting because of my program for this particular climate change initiative or this student loan issue or some other thing. And there are pockets of money he's got to give out. And so he gets, in a sense, what looks like a news story as opposed to a direct campaign event. And probably he does something, splits the cost between the two, between just presidential travel for business versus campaign events, which is kind of the same issue that Trump's come up with on the immunity issue before the Supreme Court. So it's not an issue that only affects one person ever in American history. But at this point, I think they have made a decision after the State of the Union where whatever drugs they provided him so that he was on his feet for 90 minutes and sounded like he was in charge and vigorous and excited and angry and happy to be out there and so on and so forth, they've kept up the pace a little faster than had been the track record prior to the State of the Union. I mean, before the State of the Union, there were lots of commentary that he was going to get thrown off the ticket. If he's the only person who could lose to Trump, and Michelle Obama was going to be the nominee, or Gavin Newsom was going to be replacing him, and so on. That talk's really stopped after the State of the Union. Now, if there were a series of 6 national polls that showed him losing to Trump by 3 to 5 points, I think that conversation will pick up. But I think it's less likely now that someone else will be the nominee than it was before the State of the Union. I thought that was a real possibility, that they would keep him as a placeholder and see how he did, because it's easier to go with an existing horse who can be controlled. But at this point, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what the numbers look like, but the numbers have been fairly stable, but with a wider dispersion than you normally get for a close race. And that tells you something odd is going on here, whether people are not being honest with pollsters or whether the wrong, not a complete sample is being used in various polls, one firm versus another. All of those are possibilities. I mean, could there be shy Trump voters? I mean, that's an issue with the Jewish vote, whether there are people who are ready to vote for him because they're sort of terrified of what it's like to be Jewish in America now for the first time in their lives. It could never happen here. It's happening here. But if they've never voted Republican in their lives, and Trump would be the first one, it's not a proud moment where they're going to go out in a street corner and wave a sign, "I've become a Trump supporter."
So before we get to the Jewish vote, I just want to ask you I want to ask you actually two more questions about the general state of the race. And the first one is a line with what you were just talking about, which is replacing Biden or not. One of the things that I don't understand, and I would assume a lot of other people don't understand, is can he be replaced? I mean, they had the primaries, so would they just? I mean, so they have their convention in Chicago. How would that even work? How would they bring in Newsom or Michelle Obama or whoever? What would be the procedure for replacing him?
He can release the delegates, and then the delegates can vote for whoever they want on the first ballot. And even though people seem to always say, I miss the days of a convention where there was excitement and you didn't know who was going to win, those things never happen. So if that were to happen, it would be arranged not only that he released his delegates, but who they would vote for.
Right. And you say that that'll be probably based on polling closer to the convention, which is supposed to be in August, correct?
August in Chicago, right?
Okay.
Yeah, the Democrats are spending an enormous amount of money polling, and you can sort of tell that they're using the results based on where they send Biden. And he's been spending a lot of time in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That is the Democrats' best hope, they think, of getting to 270. Arizona, Georgia, Nevada look less friendly to Biden this time than the three sort of blue wall states. And so they sort of need to win all three. And they're working them pretty hard.
Well, let's talk for a second about Michigan and Pennsylvania, because I think that'll kind of move us towards it. Well, I guess we can talk about, first of all, what is the state of the race in those three firewall swing states that the Democrats are looking at? What are the polls looking like there?
Yeah. The odd thing is, Michigan, of those three states, Michigan is the one that's been most consistently Democratic. There hasn't been a Republican, for instance, elected senator in about almost 40 years there. So the races tend to be close, but the Democrats always win. Pennsylvania elected Rick Santorum twice to the Senate. They had a recent senator who got elected twice. So they've had four wins, all by small margin. Toomey. So they've won four times, which is not insignificant. They've won governor's races. Wisconsin Republicans have a Senate seat, and they've at times won governor's races. I mean, though they haven't, the current government has been Democratic twice. I would say of the three, the thing that's so odd this year is Michigan looks more friendly to the Republicans than the other two states, which is a reverse of the last two election cycles. It's not, that one is not because of the Jewish vote. Michigan, I don't think, is seeing a big shift because it's not a large Jewish population to begin with. It's about 90,000, maybe about 1% or slightly less of the population. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are different. They're both very close in the polls, practically a tie, whereas Michigan has had about a 2 to 3 point margin for Trump on average.
And do you think that and what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think in part, in Pennsylvania, there's been a shift in registered voters. The lead for Democrats among registered voters has gone from 600,000 to 300,000. And there are still blue dog Democrats in the state, the kind who have been registered Democrat their whole life, but they still vote Republican, or at least they vote Republican in the years Trump's running, because Trump's a kind of Republican that has an appeal to them that country club Republicans maybe didn't in the past. And if you look at the Senate race, John Fetterman got elected senator. He's been one of the strongest pro-Israel supporters among the Democrats in the Senate. The governor, Josh Shapiro, has been the same way, which tells you that they're sensitive to the fact that Pennsylvania is a state where the Jewish vote matters and is at risk if it looks like the party is becoming an AOC-dominated party, a Jeff Merkley party, a Bernie Sanders party. If that's the face of the Democratic Party, that's not attractive in a state that's going to be, I think, probably razor-thin close.
Okay, so wait, before we go to that, the reason I want to talk about Michigan for a second is because, at least insofar as the Biden administration's treatment of Israel, and I dare say of American Jews is concerned, Michigan figures very prominently, at least in the justification for its hostility towards both groups, towards Israel on the one hand and the American Jews on the other hand, that to win Michigan, they need the pro-Hezbollah Shiite imams in Dearborn, Michigan. And I'm wondering, I saw it argued in a couple of different places that Biden's real problem in Michigan has nothing to do with Israel and the Palestinians, and it has everything to do with the electric car mandate and his energy policies that are undermining the auto industry, and that it's the UAW that is turning against him more importantly than the Rashida Tlaib Jew haters in Detroit and in Dearborn. Can you give me your sense of how important is the Muslim vote, the Arab vote, the anti-Semite vote in Michigan for determining the outcome of that state? Where do you see things lying there?
Yeah. I mean, what's odd is that in the last couple of presidential elections, the percentage of Jews who vote for the Democrat and the percentage of Muslims who vote for the Democrat are pretty similar. The Jewish vote's about 70-30, and the Muslim vote, apparently, according to one survey, was about 65-35 in 2020. So, I mean, those are pretty similar numbers. The big difference between shifts that might occur is that among the Jewish voters, if someone voted for Biden last time and they don't want to vote for Biden this time for whatever reason, they will still vote. If there's one thing Jews do, it's vote. I mean, Jewish population share is not as high as Jewish share of all voters. So if you're at a 70-30, and let's say it becomes 60-40 for the Jewish vote in the next election, that's a shift of essentially half the margin that had occurred before among the Jewish voters. Among Muslim voters, some of them may simply not vote. That's not as destructive to the Democratic column as having someone shift their vote from a Democrat to a Republican. So if you're at 65-35 and 25% of your people decided not to vote for Biden, well, then you got close to a 50-50 race, but it would be even worse if they switched to Trump. And I don't see a lot of Muslims in Michigan or anywhere else going to suddenly vote for Trump. So that's another reason why I think shifts in the Jewish vote actually matter more, because it is a real shift, not simply an abstention.
Okay, so let's talk about the Jewish vote. So first of all, let's just give some raw numbers, and then we can talk about trends, okay? So the raw numbers that, so we were talking about in our exchanges and that I wrote about in my article, which of course, if you haven't read it, guys, you guys have to read it. It's like so important. It's on JNS. Anyway, but, and Richard is quoted there extensively. So, but let's just go over what we were talking about. You were mentioning that actually it's not just Pennsylvania. There are 4 swing states where the number of Jewish voters is larger than the margin of victory for Trump in 2016 and for Biden in 2020. And those states are Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. And so you were just saying now that Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada look pretty lousy for Biden, and that's why he's not looking at them. But let's hone in for a second on the Jews. Tell me a little bit about them.
Sure. Yeah, Pennsylvania voted for Trump by about 75,000 votes in 2016, and he lost by about 120,000 in 2020. Pennsylvania has Jewish population over 400,000. So assume you got about 300,000 who are voters. If they were 70-30 last time, and now it's, let's say, 60-40, that's a pretty significant difference. That's going to move most of the margin that the Democrats had, that Biden had in 2020, and could disappear. I mean, even if the Muslim numbers moved much less because they're not a big factor in Pennsylvania, there are lots of groups like that, little subgroups, which tear away at a margin when it's that small to begin with. I mean, 80,000 was the margin, 1.2% for Biden in Pennsylvania in 2020, and 45,000 and 0.7% was the margin for Trump. So it was not even 120,000. I misstated that. It was 80,000. 80,000 isn't much, especially, if you got a 20% shift in margin, a community of 300,000 votes, that's 60,000 of it right there. And then if you look at Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Arizona were divided by 10 to 12,000 votes. I mean, those are trivial numbers. That's like if it rained one day, instead of being clear, that could be erased for one candidate or another. And Nevada is one state where the Republicans have been showing progress for the last few cycles. They almost picked up a Senate seat in 2022, losing by 8,000 votes. They had a good candidate, Adam Laxalt. They picked up the governor's race. It's the only statewide race Republicans picked up anywhere in the country in 2022. So they almost had a sweep. They came within 8,000 votes of sweeping both of the key statewide races in Nevada. And, the power of the Democrats has typically been Harry Reid and the union and the culinary workers. But if the Hispanic shift is going on, which could be gargantuan compared to shifts among the Jewish vote or the Muslim vote, and it appears it is, they 5 to 10% shift in the Hispanic vote in a community that's 30% of voters in Nevada, that's enough to turn the state easily from one candidate to another.
I wrote my column, and a couple of my friends were like, "Oh, come on, Caroline. Jews never switch. They always vote Democrat. What happened with Jimmy Carter when he went down from 71% in 1976 of the Jewish vote to 45% in 1980? That's a chimera. It never will happen again. Jews won't move." But my sense, and again, it wasn't for nothing that I opened with the fact that you had, these very establishment Jewish organizations deciding to boycott a meeting with the Secretary of Education because he's mistreating them, because he's bringing in anti-Semitic groups that claim to be Jewish to, set against them in this meeting to completely neutralize the voices of 90% of American Jews. That's a remarkable move on their part. I mean, that's something that we just haven't seen them do. And so I felt that it was deeply significant that they took that step.
Yeah, I mean, leadership groups, especially groups that are conservative in the sense of they don't shake things up, generally don't make moves like that unless they sense they're having a real problem brewing underneath them if they don't. And I actually think there is something going on here. It's almost impossible to predict the extent of it and what the right percentage is and how many people might shift. But I think the big problem is Jews are feeling insecure in America. And that has not been the state of mind of most of the Jewish population for the time I've been alive and aware of what's going on in politics. The percentage who are concerned about what happened in Israel is higher than it was probably before October 7th. But I don't think that's the main motivating factor for why Jews may shift this time. And I think that's because Jews tend to be historically liberal. They're comfortable with the politics they've had because they think they're protected, that they've been admitted into the power bastions of American society. We've had a merit-based system. Jews do well. All of those things are essentially cloudier now. And the places that meant an enormous amount to Jewish families and Jews growing up, like getting into Ivy League schools, suddenly that sort of dream is like, really? Is that what I want pursued? So you can send your kid there and spend $90,000 and have them harassed and spat at and humiliated and called a war criminal? I mean, this is a different kind of environment. And anyone who tells you, oh, it's never going to happen, Jews will always vote 70, 75% Democrat, especially with Trump running because he's an embarrassment or he's this or he's that, I'd be ashamed to vote for him. People, when they vote and then they vote in private, will make a decision about whether they think the next 4 years will be secure or less secure for them if they vote one way or the other. And I actually think that is the issue. Jewish insecurity has become a dominant theme among Jewish voters, and that has to be problematic for Biden.
And what would you suggest? Um, what would you suggest Republicans do? I mean, the Republicans have their own anti-Semitic problems that are increasing. When you hear people say, "Oh, how dare you," claim that accusing Jews of deicide is a form of anti-Semitism. That's just the New Testament, said Tucker Carlson. And I mean, are you dumb? Like, if you're going to be accusing Jews in the 21st century of killing Jesus, in the year 33, then this is a problem. If you're going to attribute malign intentions to Jewish people because you think that 2,000 years ago they had a hand in the crucifixion, I mean, that's an issue that Jews are going to have with Trump voters or with Trump. And, the Democrats obviously are going to be capitalizing on it. Biden made it a staple of his 2020 campaign when he said he chose to run because of Charlottesville. So it's like, they have, how should the Trump administration how should the Trump campaign be looking at this? I mean, they can't anger that side of their base because they need them motivated to vote and everything. It's like
Sure.
basically their AOC versus Biden's AOC. How do you compare and contrast between the two of them, and where would you put the onus on the Trump campaign to deal with it?
Yeah. I mean, the best move Trump made when he ran in 2016 was picking Mike Pence, because you put sort of stability, you put someone who's always was a favorite of the evangelical community. Mike Johnson is the guy that the Republicans should be relying on if they want to deal with the issue you raised, because this is an observant man. This is a seriously faithful individual, and also someone who doesn't put himself first, who has a sense of humility and purpose and what nationally you're supposed to do to represent your country and lead your country. So he is a perfect respondent, I think, to those kind of calls. And if the party doesn't use him, they're making, I think, a big mistake. There aren't any natural leaders. Pence could certainly play a role in that as well. But there still seems to be some issues personally between himself and Trump, which might make that less likely. But I think the Republicans are going to lose some votes because of that kind of thinking. I don't think it's a big number. I really don't. I think on the Democratic side, I mean, half the Democrats in Congress are part of the Progressive Caucus now, and that's where all the energy is. So that's a very different thing than having half a dozen crackpots on the Republican side. And you can tell that where the Democratic base is. The New York Times had an article just in the last 2 days. They had one on AOC, one on Marjorie Taylor Greene. And the tone on one is, she really is a bridge to the future for the Democrats. And on the Republican side is, she's crazy, and this is really what the party is. So that's what the Republicans are all about. But the real energy and the real dynamic right now is entirely different. And I think the exposure of what's gone on in the college, the Republicans should make ads on that every single day and be running them for the next few months. These ads could threaten to drop the bottom out of the Biden campaign. And I think there's panic, which is why they had him come out for 4 minutes, because their overnight polls must have shown that every day this is a major story is damaging to Biden.
Yeah, but then he came out and he made that statement where it was a 3-minute statement, and it took him 2 minutes and 7 seconds to say the word anti-Semitism, which was followed in the sentence right after.
Never mentioned Israel.
He didn't mention Israel, and as soon as he talked about how anti-Semitism is bad, the next sentence was, and so is Islamophobia. And then he had a second sentence about that saying anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian discrimination. So the people who are actually attacking the Jews got two defenses, and the Jews only got one, and Israel got none. So it was a real dud of a statement, and it was the second time that he had done the on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm with the perpetrator and with his victim. And it was a remarkable indication of, like you said, where the base is. Where does he? What is it that he thinks he's trying to accomplish when he makes his statements? And it doesn't seem, just as you saw with Cardona's meeting, that they really are taking the issue of losing the Jewish vote seriously.
Correct. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But they're taking it seriously enough that they still sent him out, because they could have continued to ignore it and hope it's graduation season. They get through it. A couple more colleges like Rutgers and Northwestern make absurd concessions, to bring in 10 Gaza students and 8 faculty members and divest from Israeli companies and all the rest of it. But it's not happening. I mean, looks like it may be continuous right through the Democratic convention and conceivably right through the election. So they're straddling. They're trying to throw a couple bones, so they don't lose Muslim votes. And they're also a little nervous that maybe, just maybe, they need to kick the can a little bit to keep Jews in line too, because they clearly regard Jews as more reliable at this point than Muslims. Jews are a bigger number, and you would think they would see a greater threat in it. So far, exactly what you said about what they've said and what they've done and where he's taken his campaign suggests that they're taking one vote more seriously than the other. But I think that's in part because they associate the Muslim vote with young people voting. And young people is a much larger group than either Jews or Muslims. And their assumption is that there's a shutdown or a turnoff among young voters because, they don't have a pattern of voting Democratic. They don't have a pattern of voting. And if they think that Biden isn't doing the job and he's not protecting their allies, they may not show up. So that, I think, is really the crux of it, is younger voters in general. Then the Muslims probably, rank second there in terms of their concern.
Okay, so I have 2 questions just sort of leading off from what you said. The first one is about the young voters, because I've seen some data points that the young voters are actually, a larger proportion of young voters are now stating a preference for Trump than did in 2020. Do you know what the numbers are off the top of your head that you can share with us? Because I mean, there seems to be a shift right by young voters as well. Is that correct, or is that just I read one poll and
you have a division between those who are college educated and those who are not. And there's been an enormous shift among those who are not college educated, who are younger voters, towards the Republicans. And that's not just younger voters. That's working class voters in general have become in many ways the base of the Republican Party. As far as those who go to college, that's not a group that by and large is sympathetic to Trump. And their turnout percentages, according to the polls I've seen, that's where the problem is for the Democrats. It's not those who are already gone to the Republicans. It's those who they expected would be the normal mass of voters, just like suburban voters are shifting. And a big category of younger voters are Hispanics. And so what a lot of these shifts that are occurring are because somebody fits into a couple categories, all of which are changing. I mean, you get among a lot of minority groups, they tend to vote as the community around them does. Hispanics in Texas and in Florida have always voted more Republican than Hispanics in California. And that's because everybody else in California votes Democratic, but everybody else in Texas does not, or Florida does not. And so what you're seeing now is you're seeing people who fall into a couple of these categories, and they're seeing reinforcement. They're seeing other people like them. They don't have to essentially be the brave one, walking the plank and being the first one in the family or the only one in the family to vote a certain way.
But what about the illegal aliens? I mean, he's bringing in 8 million illegal people, and he wants them to vote. I mean, can they shift the election in places like Texas and Arizona on behalf of the Democrats?
Yeah, I got to think in Texas, in part because it's a Republican administration running it, they're going to be sensitive to this. Though, of course, a lot of this goes on in local cities. The cities are run by the Democratic administration. But I think, by and large, there will be some illegals who will vote in this coming election, probably more than voted in 2020. And the numbers headed higher. And I think a major reason why they came here is that at some point, Democrats believed they would have the trifecta. They'd have 51 votes in the Senate, change the filibuster rules. They'd control the House. They'd have the presidency. They get rid of essentially everything they want to get rid of that'll make voting and winning permanently easier going forward. So that's why you got this like a pool of 8 to 10 million potential voters where they can turn the switch if they have a particularly good election year. So Republicans sort of have to win one of the three going forward consistently, or there really is a risk essentially to the sort of future democratic norms, which is that there's a path to citizenship for legal immigrants, but it takes 5 or 10 years or whatever, the process is. But why wouldn't someone, if they have illegals here and they're already working, or they just give them the right to vote? I mean, they're old enough, they pass the age requirement, let them run for president. No, change that rule too, so you get all 10 million guaranteed to vote for him. So, I mean, it's not a healthy situation where you have all these different rules in different states, and some states simply look the other way, because what matters most is winning. And people will do almost anything to win this presidential election. Part of it is they've created this hysteria about Trump, that the country is going to become the Mongol hordes if he wins. And, he ran the country for 4 years. I mean, there are things you could agree with, things you disagree with, things you disagreed with a lot. But compared to the chaos we've had over the last year or 2 years, between immigration, crime, what's going on now on the college campuses, Americans sense disorder. All right, and so is there still a silent majority ready to show up, putting together pieces from various different groups that historically didn't vote Republican? Might that happen this year? There's a possibility.
Okay, and let me just go one more question about the Jews, which is donations. So, I think it was you who gave a data point about the percentage of large donors on the Democratic side who are Jewish. And can you just give a little bit of data on Jewish donors to the Democrats? And, if you see any tamping down on Jewish money going in. Haaretz did a piece a couple of months ago where basically they said, people like Sheryl Sandberg has given, $1 million to Biden, and the Spielbergs and all of the Hollywood Jews are continuing to give as if nothing's
Jeffrey
happened.
Katzenberg and
so it was a real question. Are Jewish donors reassessing their largesse to Biden, to Democrats, or is that just talk because most of them are progressive anyway and they just don't care?
Right. Yeah, I think that, first of all, Jewish donors to the Democratic Party historically haven't been Jewish donors because of Israel. All right, they've been Jewish donors to the Democrats because Democrats are the liberal party, and they've grown up as liberals in America. Actually, among large Republican fundraisers, Jewish donors represented a higher percentage of the large gifts than they did among the Democrats. And what you have now occurring is with all these billionaires being grown in California and other states too. I mean, it's in the thousands now. Numbers that used to be the 100 millionaires. You got a unit, now you have 10 units, and people love to be players. And this is not an overwhelmingly Jewish crowd. Sure, the guys who founded Google are Jewish, Zuckerberg's Jewish, and they may probably going to continue to give money to Democrats. But if the ugliness we've seen in the last couple of weeks doesn't get some of them to at least register a complaint with the administration, because you get some leverage when you give enormous gifts. And if that leverage isn't used to have a more sensible policy, a more equal policy, a more considerate policy, to be concerned about Jewish lives, that Jewish lives in America matter, that Israeli lives matter, well, we'll see. And if they don't, that would be unfortunate. But in the meantime, I'll take what we can get, which Sheryl Sandberg's video was a big plus. So if we can get more activity like that, even if you don't get her dollars in the campaign, it's a positive because it helps in the Hasbro wars.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess the real question, I mean, it does feel like the middle has dropped out of American political life and American social and civic life. It just have you ever seen, I guess, well, no, before I ask you whether, how do you even, whether you use the same tools to assess this election as you did in the past, I first want to ask you a question about RFK, because Robert Kennedy Jr., the thing that's interesting about him is that, he's very progressive. He's got some ideas about, what policy should look like that can appeal to populists on both sides of the aisle, that can appeal to Bernie Sanders types and Tucker Carlson types. But then he has this one thing, which is that he's very pro-Israel and he's very anti-Semitic, which is very different from the Biden administration. And it seemed to me that, he would be a good backstop. John Anderson got 15% of the Jewish vote in the 1980 election where Carter's support plummeted. And I argue, well, if those 15% hadn't had him to vote for, then Carter may well have gotten those 15% of the vote, because they wouldn't have wanted to vote for a Republican. So how big of an issue is Bobby Kennedy Jr.? Can he pick up some of those votes by Jews who just can't bring themselves to vote for Trump? And would that have a detrimental impact on Biden, or would it not? How does that work with the math? And what are the prospects of him actually being a spoiler here with a Jewish vote?
There's a couple things. First is he has to get on the ballot, and right now he's only on the ballot in about half a dozen states. So he's got a lot of work to do, but he's going to, he has money, he has lawyers now because of his vice presidential pick.
What's her name again?
And that should help him. Shannon, I think Shannon was her last name.
But you said she's the ex of one of the Google founders.
What Google founders? Yeah.
Okay.
And so his numbers have been polling in the low double digits or high single digits.
Where?
So people are. That's a national number. And that reflects the fact that pollsters are assuming he's on the ballot. So that's why they include him as a choice.
Nicole Shanahan.
It's the same thing they do with Jill.
Nicole Shanahan.
Shanahan. Okay, not Shannon. Okay. So just like Jill Stein and Cornel West are not on the ballot everywhere, but they're thrown out as an option. Usually the pollsters will do head-to-head Biden versus Trump, or Biden, Trump, Kennedy, Stein, and Cornel West. So it's one or the other is what you see. And in essence, their national numbers are going to drop. One thing is, if you're not going to win, the support for third-party candidates tends to drop closer you get to election. A lot of people may, as a protest vote, be sort of moving in that direction or will prefer that candidate, but not a lot of people simply want to waste a vote because they're not going to determine the winner. Of course, you can make an argument in 43 states in America, the election's already decided. So if you don't live in one of the 7, then you're out of it to begin with. But I think that Kennedy, for the point you made, is exactly a bigger threat to Biden because he has the liberal sort of accoutrements to go with the pro-Israel side, which is one of the groups that could essentially move from its liberal neighborhood and stray this cycle because of concerns on any number of issues related to Jews and Israel. I think Kennedy probably will poll in the single digits. I don't think he's going to drop out, and he will draw some votes from Trump as well. There is clearly a group of Republicans who can't stomach Trump. They're never Trumpers. I mean, they think worse of him even than many Democrats do. And those people might not be in the Biden camp because they see the frailty, they see the brain deadedness, if there is such a word. But Kennedy is clearly getting under their skin. Trump must have seen some polls that suggest he's losing some votes too, because he's been attacking Kennedy too. But you could look at that and say it's a smart move. He's trying to let the voters know that Kennedy is really someone who takes votes from Trump, which makes him more attractive to Biden voters, if you think about it as sort of a second stage way to look at it. But the votes that are almost guaranteed to come from Biden are the Cornel West and Jill Stein voters. I mean, Jill Stein helped elect Trump in 2016. If she gets 2% again and Cornel West gets 2%, given how close this election might be in a half a dozen states, that's a big deal. And some of them have party tickets that'll get them on more states. They're already essentially on the ballot. The party that's hurt the Republicans has been libertarians, and they are the sort of a national ballot access, and they usually nominate their own candidate, and they get 1 or 2%, and they've cost Republicans a couple Senate seats over the years. Not clear that they're going to be as big a factor this year. They're not showing up anyway in the polls, and I couldn't tell you who they're considering even as a candidate. It's not become newsworthy, which you think if the media was trying to damage Trump, they would be making a big case, vote libertarians. They have an attractive candidate, for all you Trump voters looking for a path of feeling a little more secure. So third parties will matter this year. In 2016, they were 6% of all votes. 2020, they were 2% of all votes. And it's one of the reasons why Biden did better than Hillary Clinton and wound up winning a very close race rather than losing a close race.
So 2 questions to finish up, and you can take them in either, whatever order you want to. The first one is, what do you think that has to happen in order for the Jewish vote to just shift back to where it's always been, which is the Democrats, and this whole conversation to become entirely theoretical as opposed to significant and important? And the second question is, when you look at the situation with these 2 candidates, with Trump being tried in 4 different jurisdictions and Biden so frail and incapable of speaking ad lib or campaigning in any significant way, or really, competently carrying out the duties of his office, and yet here he is again at the top of the ticket. It just feels like we're charting a new course in American politics, that this is a very different election, and that it's very difficult to learn from the past what have takeaways from the past that are useful today. So take these in either order. Maybe start with a general question and move to the Jews, since that's the point of this discussion, is specifically the Jews. But whichever you want, and
yeah, I think the Jewish vote moving in its traditional direction would depend on the Jewish situation and Israel's situation moving in a traditional direction, which means it looks like the threat to Jews in America has been resolved. It's disappeared. The crazies are not out on the street anymore. They're not threatening anybody. And the war in Israel is winding down, and Israel's going to have relations with Saudi Arabia. Tom Friedman's going to write his 878th column on a 2-state solution. And we'll be headed in that direction. And the community of nations is going to rebuild Gaza and make sure that nothing bad ever comes out of there again. And Bibi Netanyahu will be deposed, and that we can live happily ever after, because, the real problem has been at least half Israel's fault over the last so many years. And there are unfortunately a lot of American Jews who think that. And so they'll be happy if Israel is not the issue in their face anymore. They prefer to get back to the things that matter, like abortion rights and climate change and 18 genders. But given that's unlikely to happen, I don't think it's going to get resolved. I think this issue is going to be with the Democrats really right through the election. I mean, you are much more in tune with what's going on day to day and the negotiations and Netanyahu's status and what might happen in Rafah than I am. But I don't see any magical solutions or anything to heal our wounds and bind the nation together. It just seems completely off chart. The second issue is the general craziness and the sort of peril for a country that has no center anymore, and where the candidates, each for the other side, is why not the worst. American the best people are the ones we wanted to run the country. And I think one very positive thing Trump could do would be to pick someone as a vice presidential candidate who everyone would look at and say, this man or this woman could be president, and there would be a good thing. And that Mike Pompeo fits that category. Tom Cotton fits that category. I mean, these are people who have military background, who are no-nonsense people, who are clear thinkers, and who probably a large number of Trump voters would prefer to be on the top of the ticket than number 2 on the ticket. But it is what it is. And Trump's no youngster. He's 77 and has health issues. Biden's 81 and he has health issues. Vice president really matters at this point. And Trump can have a huge advantage if he has a substantive, bright, consensus-type vice presidential candidate that people will respect looking on the alternative of Kamala Harris for the Democrats. That could be a huge advantage for the Republicans if they use the spot wisely. And I hope they don't pander based on race or sex or even a particular state, because I don't think that's the best way to do it.
Right. Well, Richard, I think it's been really riveting and important to have this conversation. I thank you very much for your insights about the election generally and the Jewish situation specifically. I hope to have you back on again as we get closer into November and see what the state of the race is looking like as we go forward with the Jews and more generally with the United States, because obviously so much is riding on it for Israel, for the United States, for Jewish people all over the world. So anyway, I thank you very much for joining me today, and we'll have you back again soon. Take care.
My pleasure, and thanks again for the invite.